Hi everyone, welcome back to Pages of the Globe. Today I'm going to be reading Huey's short story, The Man in the Moon, by L. Frank Baum. Now, L. Frank Baum was an American author best known for his children's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which most of you have probably read, watched, or at least heard of. Now, he was born on May 15th, 1856, in New York. He was the seventh child of 9 children, so he had a lot of siblings, but only 5 of them ended up surviving till adulthood. He had a pretty good education. He was tutored at home till 12, and then he attended the Peekskill Military Academy for 2 years. And his father brought him a printing press, which kind of ignited his desire to write. And his brother, Frank, and his brother, Clay, began publishing the Rose Home Journal. So, by the time Frank was 17, he began publishing his second journal called The Stamp Collector, and started operating a stamp dealership with his friends. After establishing a poultry breeding hobby when he was 20, Frank Baum started a new trade journal called The Poultry Record. And then when Frank was 30, his first book was titled The Book of Hamburgers, a brief treatise upon the mating, rearing, and management of different hamburgs. And then in 1882, he got married, and during that time, he actually started writing plays, and he started acting in some of them in a theater that his father had built for him in New York. And so while he was on tour with one of his plays titled The Maid of Erin, his theater was actually burnt to the ground, and all of his scripts that he had written were burned. So those were just kind of lost to history, and the public will never get to read them. So after some time, he even actually started a store in 1888, but that went bankrupt. And then he started reporting for the Evening Post, and he worked as a traveling salesman. Now, in 1897, he wrote Mother Goose in Prose, which was successful enough that he was actually able to quit working. And his next book, Father Goose, his book, was published in 1899 and became that year's best-selling children's book. Now, L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published in 1900, and it became a huge success. It remained the best-selling children's book for 2 years in a row. Now, after that, he wrote many other books that had to do with the characters from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and several more of them were published after his death. Now, he also published several non-Oz books, short stories, and plays under his own name and under pen names, one of them, The Man in the Moon. He died on May 16th, 1919, at the age of 62 in Hollywood, Los Angeles, after a stroke. The movie The Wizard of Oz was made and released in 1639, so 20 years after his death, and it became one of the most famous and beloved children's movies of all time. Now, The Man in the Moon is a very interesting short story about the man in the moon who is very lonely because he lives by himself on the moon, and he wants to go down to Earth to meet everyone because where he lives, there's no one else other than him. So he decides to travel down to the Earth, but he encounters many problems because he's not used to the culture there, he's not used to the temperature there, he's not used to anything there. So it's kind of a comical short story about his experiences there. Now, the inspiration for this short story, I can only assume, is from the Chinese folktale about the twin sisters in the moon, which is basically about these twin sisters who lived in the moon, and they were so pretty that instead of sleeping at night, everyone would stare at them all night long because they were so pretty, and then they would fall asleep when the sun rose, when it was time to actually go out and work. And so because of that, there was a shortage of food, there was no one was working, basically. So the father of these 2 twins decided that he would switch his son, who was residing in the sun, and his two children, his two daughters, who were residing in the moon, and he would switch them. So that way, whenever people tried to look at the twins, who were very pretty, they would burn their eyes. And the man wasn't handsome enough for them to keep looking at him all night long. So, after a while, people started actually going to sleep at night and working in the mornings. And any time they tried to look at the twins, they would suffer extreme burning, because if you stare at the sun for too long, your eyes are going to burn, and if you do it too often, then there is a high chance that you could go blind. So, without further ado, let's start the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like to hear next. The Man in the Moon by L. Frank Baum. The man in the moon came tumbling down and inquired the way to Norwich. He went by the south and burned his mouth with eating cold peas porridge. What? Have you never heard the story of the man in the moon? Then I must surely tell it, for it is very amusing, and there is not a word of truth in it. The man in the moon was rather lonesome, and often he peeked over the edge of the moon and looked down upon the earth, and envied all the people who lived together. For he thought it must be vastly more pleasant to have companions to talk to than to be shut up in a big planet all by himself, where he had to whistle to keep himself company. One day he looked down and saw an elder man sailing up through the air towards him. This elder man was being translated instead of transported, owing to a misprint in the law. And as he came near, the man in the moon called to him and said, "How is everything down on earth?" "Everything is lovely," replied the elder man, "and I wouldn't leave if I was not obliged to." "What's a good place to visit down there?" inquired the man in the moon. "Oh, Norwich is a mighty fine place," returned the elder man, "and it's famous for its peas porridge." And then he sailed out of sight and left the man in the moon to reflect upon what he had said. The words of the elder man made him more anxious than ever to visit the earth, and so he walked thoughtfully home and put a few lumps of ice in the stove to keep him warm, and sat down to think how he should manage the trip. You see, everything went by contraries in the moon, and when the man wished to keep warm, he knocked off a few chunks of ice and put them in his stove, and he cooled his drinking water by throwing red-hot coals of fire into the pitcher. Likewise, when he became chilly, he took off his hat and coat, and even his shoes, and so became warm, and in the hot days of summer he put on his overcoat to cool off. All of which seems very queer to you, no doubt, but it wasn't at all queer to the man in the moon, for he was accustomed to it. Well, he sat by his ice-cool fire and thought of his journey to Earth, and finally decided that the only way he could get there was to slide down a moonbeam. So he left his house, locked the door, and put the key in his pocket, for he was uncertain how long he should be gone, and then went to the edge of the moon and began to search for a good, strong moonbeam. At last, he found one that seemed rather substantial, and reached down to a pleasant-looking spot on the earth. And so he swung himself over the edge of the moon and put both arms tight around the moonbeam and started to slide down. But he found it rather slippery, and in spite of all his efforts to hold on, he found himself going faster and faster, so that just before he reached the earth, he lost his hold and came tumbling down head over heels and fell plump into a river. The cold water nearly scalded him before he could swim out, but fortunately he was near the bank, and he quickly scrambled upon the land and sat down to catch his breath. By that time it was morning, and as the sun rose, its hot rays cooled him off somewhat, so that he began looking about curiously at all the strange sights and wondering where on earth he was. By and by, a farmer came along the road by the river with a team of horses drawing a load of hay, and the horses looked so odd to the man in the moon that at first he was greatly frightened, never before having seen horses except from his home in the moon, from whence they looked a good deal smaller. But he plucked up the courage and said to the farmer, Can you tell me the way to Norwich, sir? Norwich? Repeated the farmer musingly. I don't know exactly where it be, sir, but it's somewhere away to the south. Thank you, said the man in the moon. But stop! I must not call him the man in the moon any longer, for, of course, he was now out of the moon, so I'll simply call him the man, and you'll know by that which man I mean. Well, the man, but I nearly forgot what I have just said. The man turned to the south and began walking briskly along the road, for he had made up his mind to do as the elder man had advised and travel to Norwich, so that he might eat some of the famous pease porridge that was made there. And finally, after a long and tiresome journey, he reached the town and stopped at one of the first houses he came to, for by this time he was very hungry indeed. A good-looking woman answered his knock at the door, and he asked politely, Is this the town of Norwich, madam? Surely this is the town of Norwich, returned the woman. I came here to see if I could get some pease porridge, continued the man, for I hear you make the nicest porridge in the world in this town. That we do, sir, answered the woman, and if you'll step inside, I'll give you a bowl, for I have plenty in the house that is newly made. So he thanked her and entered the house, and she asked, Will you have it hot or cold, sir? Oh, cold by all means, replied the man, for I detest anything hot to eat. She soon brought him a bowl of cold pease porridge, and the man was so hungry that he took a big spoonful at once. But no sooner had he put it in his mouth than he uttered a great yell and began dancing frantically about the room. For of course the porridge was so cold to earth folk was hot to him. And the big spoonful of cold pease porridge had burned his mouth to a blister. What's the matter? asked the woman. Matter? Screamed the man. Why, your porridge is so hot it has burned me. Fiddlesticks, she replied. The porridge is quite cold. Try it yourself, he cried. So she tried it and found it very cold and pleasant. But the man was astonished to see her eat the porridge that had blistered his own mouth, that he became frightened and ran out the house and down the street as fast as he could. The policeman on the first corner saw him running and promptly arrested him, and he was marched off to the magistrature for the trial. What's your name? asked the magistrature. I don't have any, replied the man, for of course he was only the man in the moon, and it wasn't necessary he should have a name. Why, I'm the man in the moon. Come, no nonsense, said the magistrature. You must have some name. Who are you? I said I'm the man in the moon. Oh, that's rubbish, said the magistrature, eyeing the prisoner severely. You may be a man, but you're not in the moon. You're in Norwich. That is true, answered the man, who was quite bewildered by this idea. And, of course, you must be called something, continued the magistrature. Well then, said the prisoner, if I'm not the man in the moon, then I must be the man out of the moon. So call me that. Very good, replied the judge. Now then, where did you come from? The moon. Oh, you did, eh? How'd you get here? I slid down a moonbeam. Indeed. Well, what were you running from? A woman gave me some cold pease porridge, and it burned my mouth. The magistrature looked at him in a moment of surprise, and then he said, This person is evidently crazy, so take him to the lunatic asylum and keep him there. This surely would have been the fate of the man, had there not been present an old astronomer who had often looked at the moon through his telescope, and soon had discovered that what was hot on earth was cold in the moon, and what was cold here was hot there. So he began to think the man had told the truth. Therefore he begged the magistrature to wait a few minutes while he looked through his telescope to see if the man in the moon was there. So, as it was now night, he fetched his telescope and looked at the moon, and found there was no man in it at all. It seems to be true that the man has gone out of the moon somehow or the other. Let me look at your mouth, sir, and see if it's really burned. Then the man opened his mouth, and everyone saw plainly it was burned to a blister. Thereupon the magistrature begged his pardon for doubting his word, and asked him what he would like to do next. I would like to get back to the moon, said the man, for I don't like this earth of yours at all. The nights are too hot. Why, it's quite cool this evening, said the magistrature. I'll tell you what we can do, remarked the astronomer. There's a big balloon in town which belongs to a circus that came here last summer and was pawned for a board bill. You can inflate this balloon and send the man of the moon home in it." "That's a good idea," replied the judge. And so the balloon was brought and inflated, and the man got in the basket and gave the word to let go. And then the balloon mounted up into the sky and in the direction of the moon. The good people of Norwich stood out on the earth and tipped their heads back, watching the balloon go higher and higher until finally the man reached out and caught hold of the edge of the moon. And behold, the next minute he was a man in the moon again. After this adventure, he was well contented to stay at home. And I have no doubt that if you were to look through a telescope, you will see him there to this day. The end.